Hello, today I would like to quickly go over what the Dream Act is, what DACA is, and the timeline for both. So it all starts with the Dream Act, which was introduced in 2001 to Congress. This was a bill that, if passed, would have given dreamers, people who arrived in the United States without documents before the age of 18, a path to citizenship. Now, this act, while in itself is broadly supported, had some details that weren't acceptable to some members of Congress. And so it never did get passed. And for years, it would be reintroduced. It was introduced about 3 times, but it never quite got the votes to pass through Congress. In 2012, President Obama, who was frustrated that he couldn't get his own version of the Dream Act through, decided to take matters into his own hands, and he signed an executive order called DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. This is not the Dream Act. It's a temporary measure that was meant to give the dreamers, people who arrived as children, a way of staying in the country legally until the Dream Act could be passed. So he signed an executive order, and one of the things it did was it instructed ICE to consider dreamers to be the lowest priority for deportation. So it moved them to the back of the line for deportation. And he also gave temporary 2-year visas to people who arrived as children. These could be renewed every 2 years. And so this was intended to be a short-term thing, but it's still in place 8 years later, as the Dream Act has never been passed. Of course, President Trump was elected in 2016 to become the president. And in 2017, after several months of deciding what to do, he announced that while he does support the Dreamers and would like to see a good solution for their situation, he believed that DACA was illegal, that it unconstitutionally bypassed Congress. And so he said that he would cancel DACA. Immediately after President Trump canceled DACA, he was challenged in court. And for the past several years, the DACA case has been moving its way up through the courts all the way to the Supreme Court, where it is now. Interestingly, the case against DACA is not that President Trump did not have the right to cancel it, but rather that he didn't thoroughly explain his reasons for canceling something that affects a lot of people. So at any time, he could have released a memo explaining his reasons and ended the case. But it seems that perhaps, first of all, President Trump doesn't mind DACA staying in place while the Supreme Court decides. He doesn't, after all, want to deport the Dreamers. And secondly, he would like for the Supreme Court to rule on the constitutionality of DACA. Which brings us to the present. In June 2020, the Supreme Court will decide the fate of DACA. They will decide whether it was constitutional for President Obama to create DACA in the first place and whether President Trump properly ended the program. So what's next? Well, if the Supreme Court rules DACA to be unconstitutional, President Trump will have leverage for his own Dream Act deal. President Trump has said that he wants a good deal for Dreamers, but he will very likely tie this to border wall funding. If the Dream Act is not passed and DACA doesn't exist, this would be a very bad thing for the Dreamers. And so President Trump would probably have a lot of leverage for Democrats. They would be afraid not to vote for a deal to legalize the Dreamers. On the other hand, if the Supreme Court rules DACA to be constitutional, then President Trump would still be able to cancel it, although he may have to release a memo. However, another president could reinstate DACA later. Therefore, Democrats may hold out until November to see the outcome of the election. So, stay tuned, pay attention to the news, and this June, you'll see the next chapter in the Dream Act and DACA saga.